Welcome to the blind zone. What is a blind zone, you say? It's something that happens to you all of a sudden, or it's something that you refuse to see that was right in front of your face. And this morning, I have a neighbor of mine, Nancy, and we're going to be talking about really the tapestry of how things are interconnected. And I'll introduce you first to Nancy, and then we'll talk about her story and how it all got started. Anyway, welcome, Nancy. And now that I've read you out there were neighbors, so I've known you. Well, you can say how
Yeah.
exactly we got started in
Well,
the whole process.
thank you, Denise, for having me on the Blind Zone. And yes, a number of years ago, a friend of mine and I came over and we welcomed you to the neighborhood. And so that's how I first met you.
Hmm.
And then last summer, we happened to both go to a neighbor's funeral. And I had just come back from a mission trip. And I guess you asked me about it. So I got talking about that. And that's what led you, I believe, to ask me on the show. So
That's true. That's true because you were part of the welcome committee. I just moved to this complex, and you and the other gal were part of the welcome committee, and you came in and you gave me all the what for and how about this, and so that was super fun. And because you were really like the first people I knew here, or I got to know.
uh-huh.
And so then, like you said, our neighbor Coco had died, and you were. I was going to go with you to the funeral, and then on the way there, I had mentioned, "Oh, I just heard you came back from a trip. Where'd you go?" And you said Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole show is providentially directed. So when I was praying, who should I invite on the blind zone? It was whispered in my ear, Nancy. And then I remembered the Africa story. And the best part about this, for me anyway,
Yes.
is that when you and I were talking, I was thinking it was going to be one thing. And the Lord showed me that your story is one of tapestry, and that a lot of times it's all the knots and the strings in the back that we focus on. But when you flip that over, it's a beautiful picture. And
Right.
the story you're going to tell us today is one of tapestry, and how the threads wound from you, your church, and you to your husband, to his company, to other, and it just keeps rolling backwards. But it's
Right.
where so we're going to start. And now that I'm trying to talk us backwards, we're going to go back to the beginning, and you're going to tell us about the original person who's, and what was the name of the ministry that it's under now, for clarification?
Are you Molly Children's family? Are you talking about Charles?
Right, Charles.
Yeah,
Well,
Charles
the
Molly.
Charles Mully, but the organization that it's under now is
It's called Molly Children's Family, and but there's also a Molly Children's Family USA, which is the group here that supports
okay,
them in
okay,
Kenya.
okay. But I thought there was Janine's group is named
Yes, Janine's group is called Heart for Africa.
Heart for Africa. Anyway, so
Yes,
it's not that I've confused everybody by not knowing
that's all
who
right.
we're talking about. But the point is we're going to be talking about how here we are here, but
Mm-hmm.
we're going to be talking about a missions field that is in Africa and how the whole thing started. So we're connected from here to Africa. So tell us
Yes.
first off briefly about the Charles Mully story, because that was fascinating.
Uh-huh. Okay. Um, I was interested in coming when you wanted me to share about African missions because the first thing I thought of was very few times in our lives do we get to meet someone so special that we see God's hand on, and it's like having a very close friend like Mother Teresa. And he is the closest thing to Mother Teresa. Jesus is not walking the earth right now, except living in us. But Charles is the most amazing person, he and his wife, that I've ever met. And so I was honored to be able to tell some of his story.
Okay.
And he was a young boy. He was the oldest of a big family. This is in Kenya, and his dad was an alcoholic, and he grew up in a very abusive environment where his dad would come and beat the mom and beat the kids, and they just sort of lived in a lot of fear. They didn't know what was going to provoke him that day. And so one night they went to sleep, and And the next morning, Charles got up. He was 6 years old. And he got up and he looked around and they were all gone. Family was gone. They just took off. And no note, no nothing, you know. And it was like, I think they felt that, I think the dad went away to get work, to try to find work because they were so desperate. And I think they knew there were some relatives around, that Charles was the oldest, that he could go to the relatives and get some help. And I think they thought he could fend for himself. Well, of course, that's not how Charles saw it, but um, so he did go to those relatives because he was like, "What do I do?" And they were like, "Shoot, get away from here. We've got our own problems. We've got our own kids to take care of." And he was like, just bewildered. I mean, I just can't even imagine being 6 years old and something like this happening to me. And so eventually this threw him out on the street. He became a street child, just borrowing, begging, stealing, whatever he could do to stay alive. It was just so horrible. And this went on for years. And he was 6 when he was in his like mid-teens. I mean, he said it looked so bleak. He felt so hopeless. He thought of taking his life. And he said he was just sitting down by the water someday, and some kid approached him, another teenager, and he said, "We're having something at our church, I think a crusade or something." He said, "Why don't you come with me?" So Charles went with him, and he heard someone preach and share the gospel, I think for the first time. He gave his heart to God at that meeting, and he just, from that point on, he had hope that things could be different. And so he was trying to figure out what to do. At some point, he decided to walk to Nairobi. It was 3 or 4 days. It was sort of a treacherous walk. But he walked there. He tried to beg a little bit, but nobody would give him anything. So he said, I just started knocking on doors. Like, can I work? Could you hire me to, can I do something so I could get food? And this lady, I believe that she was from India, she was like, what's all that banging on? And he said, I need work. And so she let him come in, and I think he scrubbed floors, he washed dishes, he did anything he could, and he got food. And he was so blessed to be able to eat. And anyway, this lady really, really liked him. And she just saw that he was smart, that he was a hard worker. And her husband ran some kind of he had a job where he managed fields. And she said, would you hire Charles to be one of your workers out in the fields and stuff, and manage one of your fields or something? It was, I don't know if it was a coffee plantation. I can't remember what it was. So he's like, sure, I'll give him a try. So Charles went out there, and oh my gosh, it was just like can't think of the word, but he just took to it right away. And so he got doing well. And one day there was a young woman who just happened to be out there with her mom or something. And they just connected. Well, her name was Esther. And down the road, Charles started like making a little money, and he bought him what's called a matatu, which is like a taxi. And he just kept saving his money, and he would work in the fields during the day and supervise. And then at night, he would drive his taxi to take people places to make extra money. He was a hardworking kid. And eventually he married that young gal, Esther. And anyway, his business grew and grew and grew. He had taxis, eventually he had buses, he got into real estate. It was like God just opened the door. Everything he touched, he prospered. And they ended up they raised 8 children. They had 7 biological children, and he also took in his sister when she was little. So they raised 8 children, and God just blessed the socks off of him, basically. And he eventually became a very, very wealthy man. It was just like he went from rags to riches, basically. And he was in Nairobi one day. He had a meeting with some big government official. And he was down there, and he had a fancy car. And these street kids were like, hey, you need to pay us to watch your car. And he was like, well, why should I do that? And so he said, no. And so he went into his meeting. And an hour or two later, he came out, no car. There was glass all over the street. And he was shocked. He was just totally shocked. And so he had to go and get on one of his buses to go home. And all the way home, he was like, why didn't I help those kids? I used to be one of those kids. And God just started speaking to him. And just over the next few years, God just started calling him. And he said, Charles, he said, I want you to serve those kids. I want you to help those street kids. And he wrestled because it was like the rich young ruler. He had a lot. You know, it's not as hard if you don't have anything, but he had a lot. He had all these businesses, and he used to take his family on vacations. And so he wrestled, I think 2 or 3 years he wrestled with this. And finally he was out driving one day, and he said, I pulled over, and he said, I just wept. He said, I was just in the car with God for like 3 hours. And he finally said, God, you can have it all. I'll do this. I will be obedient. And he said this peace just came over him. And he said, I went home. Of course, he told his wife first. And then he said, every night they had a big family dinner. And they would always talk about the day and what was going on. So they all gathered around. And he said, I have some news. And one of the daughters said, are we going on a vacation? He was like, no, that's not the news.
Yeah, this is the part of the story that takes the nice twist.
Yes. And so he said, God's really spoken to me that I am supposed to help the street kids. I'm supposed to stop working and just give everything away. And I mean, the look on their faces, one of the girls said, there's a movie called Molly about this. It's free on YouTube and other places. But she said, that was one of the fastest dinners we ever had, because they were just in shock, because they thought,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, this is going to be great. We're going to go on, do something special. And oh my gosh, it shocked them, totally shocked them. And she said that was the quickest dinner we ever had. So you see it just sort of, that part ended. And then all of a sudden, Esther, who is a saint, started, I'm sure, fixed him up a bunch of bread and stuff. And he started going to the street in the evenings and talking to the kids, because they were out there sniffing glue and doing everything they could to stay alive.
Yep, yep.
And he started feeding them. And at first they were like, what's this man? They were suspicious, And he eventually got to know them and know who had no one. And he brought a couple of small children home. And over the next months and years, he just started bringing kids home that had nobody, and became a dad to these kids. And it was hard for his children, because they were used to a nice home and they had their stuff. And they said their mom was a really good housekeeper. And all of a sudden, these kids had been on the street all their lives. They didn't know how to take care of anything. Yep. They just like tore up their stuff. And in the movie, you'll see them like jumping on the beds, and Esther just sort of sitting there like this glazed look on her face, like, oh my gosh, what have we gotten ourselves into? And at one point, Charles had been the founder of the church he was part of. He was an elder, and he took the children, a bunch of them, to the church. And the elders told him, we don't want those kind of kids here. They might corrupt our good kids, So the church turned them away. And,
Well, but see, when we first discussed this, I had mentioned to you that a number of years ago, I think it was in 06 or 07, I had went with the church I belonged to, and we went to Peru, and we helped Scripture Union feed the street boys, because the same thing happened.
Right.
The parents, generally, the original husband would die, and then in order for the wife to get remarried, she had to get rid of the rest of the kids who were from the previous relationship, or else she would have nothing.
Yes.
So that she would take these kids, 4, 5, 6, 7, however old they were, and just shove them out the door. And that was that. Now, I know it's now illegal to do that in Peru, but when we were there, I mean, exactly what you said. They were sniffing glue. They were, because horrible things happen. And then, the police would come and round them up and feed them rat poison and kill them and electrocute them. And they did horrible things. But again, it was people like Charles and the Scripture Union group in Peru that said, we can't have this. And even the church that said, we don't want those kind of kids because they'll affect our kind of kids.
Right.
they weren't leading and shining the light of Christ
No,
either.
of course
And I'm
not.
sure now they've
Yes.
all
Oh, they have.
reflected on that. And
Yes, they
but
have.
again, life is a learning process. You just
Mm-hmm.
slowly roll through it. And I really appreciated the fact that you said it took him 2 to 3 years to come to terms with that, because
Yes, it
in
was
some of my
hard.
obedience, some of my
Yes,
obedience, I'm like,
yes.
okay, and I can feel myself pulling back. But again,
I
nobody's life
know.
is on the line, and I'm not, saving, kids who are squandered and things
Right,
like that.
right.
So then Charles does all this, and he starts, and this is where we're going to pick your story back up, because here's
Okay.
where some of the threads of the tapestry reconnect now. So Charles has started this. What is his vision? Now, I know I know the story because we've talked, but I need you to share it so that people understand it. Now, he's using his own home. He's having people come in, kids
Mm-hmm.
come in, and I'm sure he sees that that's not in the best interest of everybody involved. So, what's the next step to his
Well,
process?
the house just got too full. There was just too many children. There was like an unlimited supply of kids that had need. So eventually, he had some property in another part of Kenya called uh, wait a minute, my mind just went blank. Delani. It was Delani. This was Eldoret. And in Delani, he had just a parcel of land, and he still had a big bus that he owned. So he loaded all the kids up on the bus and his wife, and they drove out to Delani. And I mean, it was just barren, no trees, really, no water. And the people out there said, you can't get water. There's just not going to be water on this land. They tried boreholes, they tried this and that. And so up front, one of the children died, one of the little kids died. And so Charles, I've never known anyone to pray like this man and his wife. They have stayed in our home here in the neighborhood several times, and they get up early and they pray for hours. I'm like, I, I saw it firsthand. And so anyway, when this child died, he was so heartbroken. He's like, God, I know you didn't bring us to the land to hurt these children. And he's like, please, we need water. So they were praying. And one night, God woke them up and he said, Charles, once you get up and just follow where I tell you to go. And he told them to go out their door and go a certain distance. And he said, okay, at this point, he said, take a left and go down here. And he told him, he said, stop right here. So Charles put a marker there. He didn't know it was at night. And so the next morning, and he said, I want you to dig for water there. And so the next morning, he got the kids together and he said, okay, guys, he said, God told me there's water. And they're like, they've had experts come out and say there's not water. He said, God told me that. So they started digging. And in the movie, you'll see they dug and they dug this huge, huge hole. And at one point, his son, because I think his kids were starting to wonder, like, is dad really hearing from God? Like, he's disrupted our beautiful family life to bring all these street kids in.
Mm-hmm.
And some of their own children ended up going to boarding school for a while. And so at first, it was hard for them. It was very hard. Um, so, and he said, Dad, he's like, we're just not finding water. And Charles said, God said, it's here. Just keep digging. He was like, okay. So you just see him digging and digging. And finally, and it's deep. All of a sudden, there's a rock. And they hit this rock and they're like, what is this? And they just hit the picks or shovels, hammers, whatever they had. And all of a sudden, you see water just sprout out from this rock. And the kids were like, oh my gosh. And they were just like dumbfounded. And they just started praising God and singing and rejoicing because water's life over there. You've got to have water. You can do without food a little while, but you can't do without water.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the one son said, oh my gosh, from that point on, I knew Dad wasn't crazy. He was hearing from God. And so he was like, okay. So, and they still, when I was over there last summer, they have this, it's called Jacob's Well, which is what they named this area. And it's still there today. It's still producing water. And that was just gave these kids life, just gave them life. And they started trusting him. And then they started doing some farming, working on the land, and they planted trees. All the kids like had a tree they had to take care of. He taught them a lot about the environment and stuff, because when you have trees, it changes the whole environment and brings more rain, and it was just amazing. So it just over time he started teaching them how to build structures, and they would build places for to 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 live, places for the boys and the girls, and then they would build little huts for schoolrooms, and just one thing led to another. And oh my gosh, to see the before and the after, and it's phenomenal. It's just phenomenal what's happened.
But it was the faithfulness that
Yes,
Charles went from nothing,
yes, he
then he
did.
got everything,
Yes,
and
and
then
went back to nothing.
then God told him to give everything up, and then
Yes.
now he's bringing him back to plenty, but not plenty for himself,
No, no.
plenty for the kids that
Well,
he was entrusted.
and there were still moments, because at one point they took a bunch of beans and rice, because at first they had no food out, and they had not planted gardens or anything. And at one point Esther came to him and she said, Charles, we're about out of food. And she said, what do we do? He said, God told us to do this. He said, you need to go to God. Don't look to me, go to God. And so, I mean, they prayed, of course. And there was this lady in town who heard about what they were doing. And it wasn't long after she brought this big truck, and she pulled up and she said, I heard about your ministry. And you see them unloading bags of rice and beans and all this stuff. And she gave them a bunch of money. She said, I just want to help what you're doing. And Esther was like, oh my gosh, it's like God directly answered their prayer. And that started things. And then they started planting. And because Charles knew a lot about growing things from his work on the farm and everything, and they started just fields, and they didn't, it wasn't like child labor type thing. Down the road, of course, they ended up hiring people, because they basically were father and mother. All those kids call them mom and dad, mom and daddy, and they all do. And this has been going on now for, it'll be 34 years this fall. Charles was 40 years old when this happened. So he is 74 now. It's going to, this November, it will be 34 years. And over these 34 years, he has rescued and educated and loved on over 26,000 children. It has just been like mind blowing. And one of the things that has so blessed me about it is that the kids, they are the most humble, sweet kids I've ever seen. And they are so appreciative, and they're cared for. And these kids come in, they're from all backgrounds, Muslim, Christian, whatever, no religious affiliation, nothing. He just loves them. Over 90% of them come to know the Lord and walk with him just because they are so loved.
Well, and I know that at Scripture Union, you had mentioned a point that they had brought these kids in and they hadn't been in an environment like that. I know in Scripture Union, they take them in steps. They'll take them off the street, but they won't put them in a hotel because they won't know how to do with that. So the next thing they do is they give them a box, and they don't just say stay out here in the box. They're like, here's some shelter, and then they gradually move them up so that these kids learn how to trust. And even the tapestry thing is so pertinent in this, because Hattie knocked on the Indian woman's door, and then her husband, had agriculture.
Right. Oh,
It
yeah.
all just, the threads continue.
Yes.
So then now we're going to step back a little from that part of it. And now when you and I were talking, and I said, oh, you just came back from Africa, what was that like? And then you started to describe how your husband Wayne had gotten involved. So explain that like a bit.
Okay. Well, for some reason years ago, I don't know, I wanted to go to Africa. I, I'm not a big world traveler, but I don't know if it was the animals, I don't know what it was, but I just thought, oh, wouldn't that be cool? And I mentioned it to my husband, and he was like, don't think so. He said he had a paralyzed diaphragm. This happened years ago, moving a file cabinet. He pinched the nerve in both sides of his diaphragm. And so it turned out it was paralyzed, and it's documented medically and everything else. And so he could not lay down and breathe. And so he was concerned, if he went to a foreign country like this, especially Africa, that if something happened to his machine, he wouldn't be able to breathe. And if it was a long trip, couple of days maybe, but 9 days or whatever. He was like, I'd be nuts, you know. And so he
Mm-hmm.
was concerned. But anyway, we were at church one day. We walked out of the service and he said, you'll never guess what God told me. I'm like, what? I said, what? He said, I want you to go to Africa. I was like, oh, that's great, Wayne. He was like, I don't know if that's so great, you know. And so anyway, and just a little bit later, there was a lady who had had been to Africa. She was actually a marketer in Canada. She went to Africa with a missionary friend, and it's the first time she'd ever been exposed to street children. And while she was there, they went to Kenya, and she met Charles. And so she just was blown away by what he did. And she really was there for a while and served and saw transformation and stuff. And so God sort of put it on her heart. They became part of, they went on one of these mission trips with Bruce Wilkinson with Dream for Africa. They did that for a little bit. And then he decided that God wanted him out of that ministry and he turned it over to them. And they renamed it Heart for Africa. And so for a while they were in different areas, but they felt drawn to, back then it was called Swaziland. Now it's Eswatini, because they're always changing names of these African countries. Like, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
confusing enough for me.
yeah, yeah.
I was never a geography person.
Me neither. Yeah.
But anyway, but what happened was they had like the highest HIV rate in the world. And so there was these guys getting infected, giving it to their wife. All these adults were dying and these children were abandoned. And she just felt drawn that she needed to help the kids in Swaziland or Eswatini.
Mm-hmm.
And so she went over there with her husband and they started helping orphanages. There was a lot of children's homes and they started giving them a lot of support. And then God put on her heart to maybe get their own piece of land and build something themselves. And so she had a friend in Georgia called Sandra Green, and Sandra worked for a company named Med Assets, and her boss was John, and John was a man of means, and she brought Janine over to Med Assets one day, and they just wanted to talk to John about the possibility of him supporting maybe buying a piece of land in Swaziland. And so John had just returned from the Beijing Olympics. This was back when it was. He was very involved in the wrestling team and all that, but he had just come back and he walked in and saw this presentation going on. And so he just sat down. And 5 hours later, he got up and he saw her vision of wanting to buy this land. And he was like, wow, I want to check this out. So he wanted to pray about it. And so my husband worked for John. He was the chief administrator. Our son-in-law worked for John as the chief accounting officer. And he said, I would like you all to go to Swaziland and check this land out. I want to be sure it's good land, that, because he had been swindled before. And he was like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a wise steward. And so he sent my husband to Swaziland. Scott, our son-in-law, came a few days later. So here goes my husband going to Africa, like he said God did put on his heart. So he got to Johannesburg. That was first stop. So first night, as soon as he got there, he said, I plugged in the machine. And it worked. He was like, oh, thank you, Lord. This is so good. And so he said, I set up to try to get on the same time zone so the schedules wouldn't be too crazy. And so he stayed up and then he got really tired and he's like, okay, I got to go to bed now. So he said, I went over and got ready, turned the machine on, and it just blew up, totally blew up. And he was like, oh my gosh. And he had his computer there and he wrote me in big font. He was like, pray, in huge letters. And I got a hold of our Sunday class because there was like a 6 or 7 hours time difference. So I wrote him like, guys, because they all knew he was going. And because my husband was a Sunday school teacher at our church, and they all started praying, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do." So he said, "I'm just going to sit up. I'm just going to try to sleep sitting up because there's no way I'm going to lay down and sleep." So he did, and a few hours later, it was time to get on a plane to go to Swaziland. So got on this plane and went over there. First thing he met Ian and Janine Maxwell, but then there was Charles Molly. They had invited Charles because what they wanted to do was to buy this land and build a model just like what the Mollys did in Kenya. So that they wanted Charles's model to be their model. So they invited him. And the first thing he did was he started showing some videos to the people there of what was going on in Kenya. And when my husband saw it, he was like, oh my gosh, I've got to go to Kenya. I've got to see the model. There's no way I can build something without really seeing it and understanding it.
Mm-hmm,
so anyway, the Ian Maxwell said, okay, everybody take a break for a couple hours and we'll reconvene for dinner. So Wayne went back to the room and they were in a hotel there. There's some nice areas of Swaziland, and he was exhausted. And he said, I just got to lay down. I don't care what happens. I just got to lay down. And he lay down and woke up like 2 hours later. And he was like, oh my gosh. He was like, I slept. No machine. I just slept. And meantime, meanwhile, our son-in-law, I think, was trying to break in our house here because Wayne had a spare machine. He was going to take it over to him when he came. But anyway, Wayne was just shocked. And so anyway, Ian got him a ticket, and Wayne went to Africa. Went to Kenya. The rest of them stayed in Africa, evaluated the land. Charles looked at the land, our son-in-law, and they decided it was really good land. So anyway, Wayne got to go over. He met Charles's wife, Esther, several of his children. They toured him around for several days, and then he came home. And the whole time, he was able to sleep like a baby, no machine. Even on the way back, he could never even sleep on an airplane because it's like he said, as soon as I would fall asleep, I would choke. And anyway, so he came home, and we thought, oh my gosh, God really did a miracle. But we thought maybe he's totally healed.
Yeah.
So as soon as he got home, he lay down that night, could not sleep. It was like needed the breathing machine. So God gave him that miracle for Africa because he needed it for all those days he was there. God knew he was going to be a nutcase,
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. You need water, but you also need sleep.
You need sleep. Yeah. Sleep is very basic.
Yeah.
So anyway, but when he came home, he said, Nancy, he's like, you've got to see this. We have got to go back. We've got to go to Kenya. We've got to go back to the Mollys. And so meantime, John did buy the land. All that worked out. And then so that next year, this would be 2009, we went over there to the Mollys in July. It turned out it was our 40th anniversary. And so we didn't I don't know that we told anybody, but somebody found out about it. And they did a big celebration. Made cakes, and believe me, they don't even eat sugar, hardly at all. Their cakes are more like cornbread, and they made all these cakes, got all this like soda. And the choir sang, the acrobatic team did juggling and all kinds of things. And they just made it so special. Then Wayne and I got to give each of these little kids a little piece of cake and a soda. You thought it was Christmas. These kids were like so excited. And so we had that time with them, which was mind-boggling. And then our daughter and her son and a friend met us. And then we all went to Swaziland, and we served on a little mission team for Heart for Africa over there. And the land they bought, they called Project Canaan over there. And they wanted a farm built, because that's the first thing Charles did a farm. So they wanted to be sure there was good water and food, and so that
it could be self-sufficient.
Yes. So whoever they brought in, they'd have food and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So Wayne said, what would really be good is if Charles Molly let his oldest son come. He had like 3 degrees. His name was Kaleli, and one was agriculture. He said if he could come, he could show us what to do. Because my husband was an administrator, but really not a farmer. And so Charles said, okay, Charles and Wayne just had this bond. And he let him come, because Janine said, he'll never let Kaleli come over here. But he did. So Kaleli got to come, and he came, and he helped Wayne. That movie Out of Africa. My husband used to say, built a farm in Africa, just like Meryl Streep said in the movie. And it was just such a special time. So he was back and forth. He'd be there, then he'd fly home, and sometime I would go over there. And over time, we realized it needed to be people on the ground living there all the time. And my husband, once you turn 60 in that area, there was no health insurance. And my husband had cancer, and there was no way he needed some health care. And so we knew we were not the right people, though we prayed about if God wanted us to move there. Because if God healed his diaphragm, God can do anything. So, but we just felt like we were not the right people. So we came back. So they had water there, the farm was up and going, and God put it on the Maxwell's heart for them to move over there. So they moved over there, and from that point, we, through our support behind the Mollys, and Charles asked Wayne, he said, would you make Molly Children's Family known in the United States? Wayne's like, oh my gosh, how do you do that? You know, but God has started opening doors at different churches, and so Wayne wanted our church to be a supporter. And our church already had African ministries. So he took a few people and over there in 2011, and they were like, oh my goodness. And they came home because they saw that Charles was just a humble servant of God. And he had very low overhead. He was trying to be self-sufficient, you know, and just his costs were good, and he was accountable, because a lot of the African missions, there was just not a lot of accountability. And so they talked to the church people after coming back, and the church was very happy to make Charles a mission partner, because the church we go to, their mission is to make disciples here, there, and everywhere. And they felt like that's what Charles was trying to do in Africa. He was trying to do it in Kenya and in the surrounding areas by taking care of these children, because as the children grew up and they were educated and trained, they would go out and be successful people in their community. And they ended up having children be doctors and nurses and teachers and social workers and counselors. And up front, when their natural born kids were like, don't know about this, Dad's, you know, really lost it, and look, you know, like he's preferring those kids over us or whatever, those kids became part of it. They now had many different parts of the ministry. One leads finance, and Kalele leads agriculture, and so many of them are involved. And they learned that God's vision was so much broader than what they had as children. Because it's hard. It's hard when you see your parents all of a sudden bringing in all these kids, you know, like they're like, what the heck, you know? But they ended up loving what God was doing.
Well, but again, you had mentioned it, that your husband was on this path, and he wasn't an agriculturist, but it was the necessity of needing that path to merge with the other path, so that the strength of the tapestry could you know, have a real foundation. And the fact that Charles had it all, gave it all up, and then watched something even bigger grow. I mean, it reminds me of the George Mueller story in London, where you know, he had prayed about the orphan, you know, the orphanage, and he never took a dime, and many times it'd be sitting at the table, and there'd be a knock at the door, and then somebody would just bring in their dinner. And it was just that day-to-day confidence, because when you talk about self-sufficiency, Charles knew in his heart that he had to make that ground as workable for them. And it's the old story of Mary coming to the tomb and saying to her companions, how will we roll away the stone? They came with their spices, knowing what they were going to do. And then God did what only he could do, and to roll away the stone. So Charles is doing everything he can do. And then he's relying on God to do what only he can do. And that's by his gift of multiplication, where, you know, and as the children multiplied, so did the resources. And again, the tapestry of the whole thing is just fascinating to me, how our conversation, oh, I hear you just came back from Africa. Well, yes, I did. And then it rolls all the way back to when he was sick and pushed out of the house, and you know, 10 years. And you would think, you know, and this is where the God story sometimes falls apart for people. Well, if God was really God, he wouldn't have let him suffer for 10 years. I said, he didn't leave him alone for those 10 years between 6 and 16. Because obviously he was still alive, and horrible things happened. But it was in those horrible things that
Yes.
propelled him to keep at it and keep trying. Because at
Yes.
that point, he didn't know who God was.
Yes.
He had no idea. He just knew life was hard, life was tough,
Right.
and he persevered anyway. And then, and you have to know, in the providential will of God, he knocked on all those doors and they remained closed because he needed to knock on the one with the lady who was from
Right.
India and knock, who's here making all this noise? And then it started from
Yes.
that point. But
Yes.
but for those 10 years prior,
Oh,
he
yes.
still was weaving together a cloth
He
that was going to
was.
stand up to the beauty of what was going to come later. Because even when you said that he took in his younger sister, because you have to wonder, and
Hmm.
maybe because you said he also wrote a book. What's the name of his book again?
His book is called, well, Paul Boga, who's a Canadian, wrote the book. He came and interviewed Charles, but it's called Father to the Fatherless.
Okay, and I'm sure, and anyway, and I'm sure that gives a lot more detail about all the
Oh,
the
it
ins and outs
does.
of the thing.
It does.
But the big picture, the big story is, in times of uncertainty, I think,
Hmm.
geez, I don't know what's going to happen next. And I had to look around. And I'm not
Yes.
starving. I don't have,
Oh,
I'm not pushed out into the
Janice.
the wild. And so, I have first world problems, which are really no problems at
Oh,
all. And so the tapestry of this whole thing is how we're sitting here in Georgia, and then the threads connected from Canada to
yes.
Africa to Georgia to Georgia to Africa, and it
Yes.
just keeps building. And the fact that your church saw all the evidence and said, hands in, we're
Yes.
thrown in with it,
Oh,
and we'll
yes.
be that. And you said, and the picture in our thumbnail is a picture of your husband Wayne and Charles,
Hmm.
and he came recently to
He
readdress your
did.
class. So,
Yes.
and because he wasn't allowed out for a long time because of
Oh,
the
because of
COVID risk.
COVID, for 5 years, he hasn't been able to come. So
Yeah.
I had not seen him for, and he doesn't look any different. These African people, they don't age. I don't know what it is,
They
but
don't eat sugar. You said it
yeah, they
originally. Yeah.
don't. Yes, they are
Yeah.
very healthy. But
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
he came. It was such a delight, and I lead a Bible study, and he came to my class, and it was so sweet. And we showed a little 3 minute clip of something. After that, we just let all the ladies ask him questions, and we have one older lady uh, who's in our class who is 98 years old. She is amazing, and she had recently had a complete her hip redone, and she was determined she was going to get well so she could be there, because I believe she'd read the book and seen the movie, and she was like, I've got to meet this man. And so that morning her daughter-in-law wheeled her in a wheelchair, and I put her right next to him, and it was the sweetest thing. And he got talking to her about how his mother is 96 now. And Charles, one of the beautiful things is he did reconcile with his parents. God brought all of that full circle too. He found a little place for them on the property. His dad God touched him, ended up being an elder in the church there. I mean, God just did so much healing. But he just came, and we had just a really special time. Then he came to our Sunday class, and
Well, because I was wondering about the family connection, that's why I brought that up. I'm sure there's more details in the book
oh,
because I was wondering
yes.
because that is truly God's mercy,
Oh,
that
yes.
he came from something horrible. And
Yes.
just like the Joyce Meyer story, she says that whatever it was, but she said, God, before
Uh-huh.
before my dad dies, let
Yes.
him know you. And that came for a circle. And it's just proof
Yes.
that
Oh, yeah.
what we think in our heads is our circumstances, God is looking way down the road
He
for things. And
is.
as long as you're a willing participant, as long as you say, I surrender, whatever you want me to do, I'll do.
Right.
That's where the tapestry starts to really make the
Yes.
picture, not the knotty side, because
Oh, I
the
know.
knot
I
the knots are
know.
all strings and
Yes.
whatever. But on the other side, you see the picture that he's
Right.
that he's
Yes.
wove in, that,
Right.
and if you look close enough, you can see your own little thread in there and how you are helping the
Yes.
picture grow to be such a phenomenal thing. And again, Charles Mully he demonstrated the fact that he was obedient.
Hmm.
But after he's gone,
Hmm.
it doesn't stop with him.
Oh,
And I'm not
no.
saying he's going anywhere soon, but I'm
No.
saying we all have one thing in
Yes.
common.
Oh,
We're all going to
no.
die. So we all live, we die. And it's going to be because of the foundation that he's set.
His children are phenomenal. He has phenomenal, there's just phenomenal leadership in his children. No, I'm not concerned about that at all. But I'll tell you what, Esther's mother, he was telling us the other day, she passed away a few years ago at 120. These people, they are
No,
just
thanks.
very long lived. It is like, because years ago, my husband and I took Charles and Esther on a little vacation because Charles had commented that they hadn't honestly been anywhere for 25 years because they had just been giving themselves to the ministry. And so we took them somewhere and had just the most special time. And Esther and I were walking on the beach just talking about family, and we were talking about our moms. And then she said, "Oh, and my grandmother." And I said, I stopped. I'm like, "Esther, you have a grandmother that's still living?" And at that time, she probably was 115. And I came home and told my mom, who was blown away. And then so she made it another 5 years. So I'm like, oh my goodness, but just probably the lack of chemicals and all that, and just healthy vegetables
and the fact that they walk everywhere. I mean, because
and
when you
walk
said,
everywhere.
well, he went
Oh,
from Kenya and I'm going to walk to
oh,
Nairobi. Now,
yes,
honestly,
yeah,
I have a hard time walking from my condo to the front of the complex,
yes,
which is
yes.
a half a mile.
No, they do. They are
Yeah,
walkers. And
yeah.
Charles has so much energy, and he's very healthy. And but they do have an incredible group of young people. And the other thing is, many times when these kids graduate, what is so beautiful is a lot of them come back and they want to serve as teachers there, or counselors, or social workers. And because who better to know the children than them, because they used to be one, and they know where these kids are. And when they bring new children in, last year there was over 1,300 kids brought into they have 11 locations now, and but 1,300 over 1,300 kids brought in. And they take kids who've been there for a time, and they're like, they have a buddy system, and they stay with them. And of course those kids get counseling, and of course the first thing, they let them eat all they want to eat because they've been so hungry. But they get counseling, they get a good education. They have, in the last number of years, have their own college, because when they're like a high school senior, they're all tested in Africa. And they always write us and say, please pray. This is our big testing day. And they test for so many days. And it's not like in America where a kid can take the SAT or the ACT, and then they can keep taking it and get their scores better. But over there, they have one day, and that day determines whether they go to college or university or trade school or none of the above or just whatever. It's like everything hinges on this one huge test.
But this is the thing that's a little different than the United States also, is they're all equipping them for a better future.
Oh my gosh.
They're making sure that they have workable skills.
Yes.
And because I have a
yes.
friend whose husband is from Poland, he said, oh, no, there's no sitting around in Poland. At some point, everybody you take some kind of a test, and it says,
Yes.
okay, from now on, you're going to be, and even if you change your mind later, who cares?
Right.
Because at this point,
Yes.
but everybody's a moving cog in the society to make it forward. And so that's the
Yes.
beauty part of it too. And so
trades
then,
are respected.
right.
Yeah.
But again,
Yes.
you don't have the people just sitting around,
Oh,
because
no.
because the old scripture, you don't work, you don't eat. That's not even true there.
Right.
You have to. It's very
Yes.
much a desperate
Yes.
situation where a day to day. I had
Yes.
a friend from Hungary, and he was telling me that in Hungary you spend a third of your day just making sure you would have enough food for that day, and then the next day you did it all again. He said here, we take 10 minutes to make sure we have food for a week, and then we go off and live our own carefree lives.
Right.
And it's we have to
Right.
really appreciate the differences between our
Yes.
cultures
Yes.
and what we're up against and what they're up against.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, this has just been fascinating. So again, tell me the name of the organizations.
Okay. Well, Charles's group is called Mully Children's Family, and the movie came out a few years ago. Wayne's boss, the one that bought the land for Swaziland, he said the best way he thought that Charles could become known and supported was to do a movie. So he hired these people, and God did many miracles through the movie, touching the young people who actually directed it and produced it and everything else.
So how do you spell the name of the movie?
Mully. and it's on YouTube. It's free. You can just watch it. But if you have the time, I always encourage people to read the book first and then watch the movie.
Okay, and the
But
name of the book again is
it's Father to the Fatherless. Yeah,
by
but it's called The Charles Mully Story by Paul Boga, Boge. And so
okay.
anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And I did want to. Do you have time to me to tell you
Sure.
one other thing? Is
Sure.
they used to have a lot of street girls who had been sold into prostitution. That's the only
Mm-hmm.
way they could make it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they had the main campus in Jelani, then they had a second one in Yada, and the street girls usually were there, and they would help them. They would come and have their babies. Some of them wanted to keep their babies if they got pregnant, and some did not. It was too traumatic for them, and so they would. If the girls didn't want their baby, they would take them back to the other campus and raise them in their orphanage. But um, the girls would be taught sewing and hairdressing and all of these things, uh, and eventually computer. But in the last few years since the college is up and about, they felt like it was better. The college is also on that campus, and so they felt like it'd be better if the girls were in a safer location away from the college. So an area opened up on the coast of Africa, on the coast of Kenya, called Malindi, and they have a beautiful campus. I got to go visit it last summer, and they have dorms for the girls, and they teach them sewing and hairdressing. They set some of us down and did our hair and did all the stuff. It was really cute. And so after 2 or 3 years, the girls, they help them get out and get a business set up. Sometimes they'll go into business together, different ones. And so they help them to come out as productive citizens. They not only share about the Lord, but they help
Mm-hmm.
these
Mm-hmm.
people to gain education and practical skills so they can get out and have good lives and contribute to the community.
Right. And see, I knew that story, and that's what made me reference that they're not just setting them up for something this week. It's
Oh
setting
no,
them up
it's
for their
long
lifetime.
term.
And the fact that they've taken, because again, a lot of the reasons that the women would push their kids out is because they themselves are desperate.
Oh
If they don't find
yes.
another man, then it's not only the kids that are starving, it's them too.
Oh
So you can
yes.
see how that ball would
Yes.
roll. Here in America we think, oh, we can't even imagine, but we're not
Yes.
left in those dire
Oh no,
straits.
they really cater to the women because the women are the ones that support the families. Like on their main farm in Delani, they hire like there's 700 women that come and work in the fields and wash and cook and do all kinds of stuff. The children don't get out there and do that. They're being educated and everything else. They do teach them some skills, but they're not child. It's not child labor at all. But they
Mm-hmm,
really have
mm-hmm,
a
mm-hmm.
preference for the women because they're the ones leading the families. They really do.
Well, and even in the Bible,
Hmm.
you know, Jesus said to protect the widow and the orphans.
Absolutely.
And so, because widowhood back in the Old Testament days meant
Oh yeah.
starvation, and if
Yes.
you didn't have, and like the reason that Jesus resuscitated the boy who was
Oh
the only
yes. The widow of Nain.
the
Yes.
because if that was it,
Oh yeah. She wouldn't have had
she wouldn't
anyone.
have had anyone.
Yes.
And so again, the fact that taking
Yes.
these girls back off the street from horrible
Yes.
circumstances
Absolutely.
and then re-energizing them into something that they
Yes.
may look back and say, oh, when I was 10, blah blah, but they can put that behind
Oh
them because they can say from this day
yes.
forward
Yes.
I'm walking a different path. Because Charles could have been very bitter and talked about the 10 years between 6 and 16, and if you'd have stayed stuck there, none of the rest of the
Oh, and if he had
tapestry would
taken
have.
his life, none
That's
of
right.
this would have happened.
That's
But you
right.
know what? They are the most joyful people I've ever seen. Like when we first went to Africa, a lot of times people go on mission trips and they think, oh, I'm going to help these people. Well, you're the one that's helped because you see the joy. They have so little and they are so joyful, and we have so much and we lack joy oftentimes, because I mean, it's so sad, but
Well,
it's changed my life knowing these people.
Well, because I know when we were in Peru, we were in the Andes Mountains, and we were building a school for the street boys to live up there, and
Right.
and so they had dug these big trenches, and they found these big boulders, and they rolled them back in, and that's how they were building. And we were making straw
Uh-huh.
bricks. And so we were packing these in this wood frames, and we'd
Wow.
leave them all out in the sun. And that was that. And I said to one of the people with me, I said, we would have been to Home Depot at least 100 times. Oh, my gloves are sticky. I'm going to go buy a new pair. And they're like, look around, and they cut the trees down, and they find the
Yes.
boulders. And so they make what they have work. And I think
Yes.
we don't lack that initiative
Oh
here
my
as much.
gosh.
We're kind of on the spoiled side. But anyway,
Kind of, yes, a whole lot.
but again, first world problems, but they help meet
Yes.
the third world problems and build a
Yes.
tapestry that only God can sew together in a way that
Yes.
just brings all glory to the Father.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Charles is coming.
Mhm.
I think he lands in the US tomorrow. He's coming back for to be in the country for several weeks, just really calling on people who've been supporting him over the years. Since he couldn't come for 5 years, he wants to
Mm-hmm.
go and thank people that have been supporting him for all these years.
And again, it's a reminder.
Hmm.
It's a reminder of uh, because it's like if you don't hear from somebody for a real long time, you say, "I wonder what they're up to." So he's here to say,
He's here to
I'm
say
here to,
thank
yeah,
you
to thank you, and just
and to
as
meet
a
other groups, but to thank people that have really been a support to him.
mm-hmm,
And that's a
mm-hmm,
beautiful thing. So it was so great to see him again. And
mm-hmm.
his wife hasn't gotten a visa. He finally got a visa. Visas were very hard to get in Africa for the last number of years, but he finally got one. So he is over here going, and they're going to a lot of places. And this gentleman, one of the gentlemen that we took on that trip in 2011, he's now leading MCF USA, and he's going to be taking Charles all over the country to see these people and to meet new groups, things like that, which will be
And
great.
right, and to fundraise because
Yes, of course.
because God
Yes.
does miraculous things, but manna doesn't fall down from heaven, and
No.
sometimes we have to be the hands and feet. And Andy Stanley said a couple weeks ago there was a situation, and he said on the TV you always hear him say our thoughts and prayers. He said, but as a church we're the hands and feet, and so that's what they're
Absolutely.
doing.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so good to support them. And our pastor is going over there this summer, and our missions pastor has been there many times. And Craig takes like two groups of people at least every year besides medical teams. Oh, and one other thing is they're going to build a hospital, and it's not going to, right now, they're going to try to focus on finishing phase one, which is going to be ER, and it's going to be maternity, because the people in that area of Kenya, if they have to go to Nairobi or whatever from out in the distant, out in the boonies, most of them die before they get there. There's no medical care. So
Mm-hmm,
this
mm-hmm.
hospital is going to meet the needs for so many people. So I'm really excited about this getting done.
Again, the
Yes,
tapestry and the picture gets bigger,
yes,
and as the single threads are all wove together, I mean,
yes. And
it's just a fabulous
it is
story.
beautiful. And then like John, who gave the money for the other ministry, the company John was president over was a medical company. So I'm sure John is going to be helping with all of that. Everybody's going to be raising money to get this hospital done, because it's going to be life to so many people.
Well, and
And
again, more threads,
more
and
threads. Yep.
everybody didn't have to be in agriculture, but it
No.
was every part of the body is important, and they all work together to
Yes.
make the whole thing stand and function as a
Yes.
unit.
Yes. That's right.
The hands and feet of Christ.
Yep.
Anyway, Nancy, this has been super spectacular, and I appreciate you coming on. And again, I knew that this story is going to impact people, as we prayed before we started, that he would
Mm-hmm.
give us the words we needed to say, and that it would fall into the ears that needed to hear it. And I trust
Yes.
that'll be true. So again,
Yes.
thank you for
Thank you.
coming on and sharing your story.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's changed my life. It has changed my life.
Well, and again, I prayed and your name popped up, and I was like, good,
Yeah.
that's what we'll do.
Yeah. Well, good. Thank
Anyway,
you.
thank you for watching The Blind Zone. And like I said, I've stopped telling you what's going to be next week, because every time I plan, God has something different for me. So anyway, thank you. But we'll see you all next week on The Blind Zone.